Hi and welcome back to a new video. Today, finally RTX 4090 launch, at least the Founders Edition. I spent many days and hours getting all the data for today's video. It's a huge script. If you want to get too long didn't watch, then I can summarize it with the 4090 being about 40 to 80% faster than a 3090 Ti at the same power consumption. So we are not talking about 600 watt power consumption on the 4090, it's more in the region of 400 to 450 watt. That's the quick summary. But there is a lot more behind that, a lot more things we tested, a lot of gaming data and also a lot of power consumption data, which will definitely be very interesting and some things Nvidia might have to reconsider. We are straight jumping into 3D times by Extreme GT1 for a first estimate. And I can tell you, when I was running those first tests, I had to double check all the settings because I was like, WTF Nvidia, what is going on? Just compared to an RTX 30 or RX 6000 series, that's almost twice the performance. One quick note for the start, we did not have the time to include an RX 6000 card into our testing simply because we did not have enough time to do it. We only started with an RTX 3080 Ti and with 3090 Ti for comparison. But since we kind of know how, let's say, a 6950 XT is compared to like a 3080 Ti or 3090 Ti, I think you can still draw your conclusion. Continuing with Battlefield 2042 as our first gaming benchmark. In all benchmarks that we are performing today, you can see yellow marked the average FPS in our charts. Brownish, you can find the minimum FPS, also called 1% low. And bluish, you can see the power consumption of the card in watt. The performance of the 4090 is about 43% above the 3090 Ti in this test. And now if we add the power consumption of the card, it is getting really interesting because you would first estimate that the 4090 will draw at least 450, maybe up to 600 watt. But that seems to be not the case, and especially not in gaming. That is what you can see here with the 4090 consuming about 27% less than a 3090 Ti while performing about 43% faster. Taking the 3090 Ti as direct competitor to the 4090 is also kind of difficult, simply because the 3090 Ti had such a bad ratio of performance to power consumption. If you especially take the 3080 Ti and compare it to the 4090, it often looks quite a bit different. That's why in some charts we took the 3090 Ti as like direct comparison and also the 3080 Ti. So if we now switch over from the comparison of 4090 and 3090 Ti to the 3080 Ti, you can see that the power consumption is slightly increasing by about 5%, but at the same time the performance increases from 43% to 55%. Following our Battlefield benchmark scene, you will see that the power consumption of the 4090 is always somewhere between 300 and 340 watt. On average, we measured a power consumption of 323 watt. Also another hint, today we will only do 4K benchmarks, simply because the 4090 has such a high performance that in my opinion it doesn't really make much sense, especially to use 1080p, and even with WQHD you will run into the CPU bottleneck with some titles. And that's why we decided only to go for 4K benchmarks. The power consumption data which you just saw, for example, in Battlefield is taken with Thermal Grizzly's WireView. That's an unpublished product which we've been working on for over half a year now. It's almost ready to be published, ready to launch, not quite yet, but it's ready for me to use in videos like this because it's very helpful. Right now during the benchmark I can get the actual power consumption of the card, and it's not only like a 100-degree adapter for better cable management, but at the same time you can read out everything the card is doing. So we can cycle through because it's not only measuring but also logging the data. So for example, you can get obviously the power consumption, which is by adding up the voltage and the current. You can read out min and max values. But for me, most helpful is the average reading. The average reading is done by logging the data of the previous 60 seconds. And then underneath, you can also read out the total power consumed of the card. Fortunately, Igor from Igor's lab could confirm to us that the 4090 is indeed only pulling about 10 watt over the PCI Express slot directly, as GPUC is reporting. This means that we can either neglect the 10 watt or we can add it up later if we want to. If you want to see more detailed analysis about 4090 power consumption, it would definitely make sense that you will check out Igor's stuff at launch as well. Going over to Remnant from the Ashes in 4K Ultra. It's a little bit older title and it's still not using DLSS in our benchmark. We can see similar results compared to Battlefield 2042. The performance increase is at about 41% over a 3090 Ti, while the power consumption decreased by about 20%. But again, here if we would have compared it with the 3080 Ti instead, the power consumption would have increased by 16%, but the performance would have also increased by 53%. Again, the 4090 consumes a little bit less power than expected in this native rendered 4K scene. The power consumption of the card was always between about 300 and 370 watt, while measuring with WireView over an average of 60 seconds with 358 watt. Out of personal interest, obviously, we will include PUBG to the testing. We are running esports settings and 4K resolution. And even with 4K, this means this is going to be a high FPS title in today's test. Esports settings, by the way, means that we will neglect anything that will help us making the game look nicer, but instead it's optimized so you can see the enemies much better. With almost 500 FPS on average, even with 4K resolution, you will definitely need some strong CPU power. And if you would switch to WQHD, you would be fully inside the CPU limit. Compared to a 3080 Ti, the power consumption increased by 37%. But we also have much more performance by 85%. The power consumption of the RTX 4090 in PUBG was on average 423 watt. By the way, all the testing which we did in today's video was performed on this platform, which is still the older 12900KS. But it's still a very quick CPU. Originally, I wanted to switch to AM5 with the 7950X, but then Nvidia stated in the review guide that you might lose performance on some benchmarks with AMD. There might be some kind of weird conflict right now, and simply for the release video, I did not want to risk to get false data, and that's why I decided to go for the 12900KS instead. Already during the keynote of the 4090, you could feel that Nvidia is putting a heavy priority on DLSS 3. And before we're going to judge the technology, I think we will just get straight to it and look at some comparison numbers. Nvidia provided a special version of the 3D Mark, which is including a DLSS feature test. This DLSS feature test basically runs twice, once with DLSS enabled and once with disabled. I captured the entire footage and now we can try to spot some differences, especially if both tests are running after each other and not next to each other. For me personally, it's almost impossible to tell which test is with DLSS and which is without DLSS. Only if you pay close attention to some details, you can spot some differences. For example, if the ship is landing in the situation, try to pay attention to the left up area where you can see the edges of the ship. With active DLSS 3, those seem to be a little bit sharper than without DLSS. Without DLSS, the image generally seems to be a bit more smooth. But I personally would actually prefer the one that's a bit more sharp. You can definitely let me know what you think about it and maybe do that after we watched all the other comparison footages. Even taking the small differences into account, you have to agree that without DLSS and only 57 FPS, that is not enough FPS for a 4K 144Hz monitor. And with DLSS 3 and about 173 FPS, we are definitely in the more enjoyable region. That's about 3 times the performance. But I personally was asking myself, is this only in a synthetic test like the 3D Mark, or can we see the same kind of difference, like the same performance uplift in games and only have those very, very tiny visual differences? Continuing with A Plague Tale Requiem. That is a completely new title and it's not even publicly available yet. So Nvidia, thank you very much for making this possible, that during an experience of a new card, we can at the same time even test a game that's not even public yet. The Plague in-game scene basically confirmed our findings of a 3D Mark. Without DLSS 3 in our native rendered scene, we were seeing about 74 FPS on average. With DLSS 3 set to quality, we could observe about 145 FPS, which is already twice the performance. Switching to DLSS 3 performance, this further increased to 195 FPS. Theoretically, you could improve this further by setting this to ultra performance, which then allows to get 205 FPS. However, this is only recommended for 8K monitors because this is further degrading the image quality. The performance increase which we could observe by running DLSS was 262%. And interestingly, at the same time, the power consumption decreased by 6%. Looking at our image comparison scene again, I found it extremely difficult to find differences within the settings. At least if we judge between DLSS quality and performance, it's almost impossible to me to spot any kind of differences. However, disabling DLSS, you can definitely see differences. If you pay attention to the trees in the background, you will see that they are a bit darker and it seems like they're a bit denser than with DLSS. The native image also seems to be a little bit more smooth. Getting closer to the water, it seems to be a bit easier to find some differences. If you pay attention to the area which is more further out in the back, where you can see the stones laying in the water, you can see some kind of weird reflections that also somehow look like artifacts. I'm not quite sure if that is a feature, if it's meant to be like that, but you can see that DLSS is definitely increasing this effect. To me at least, it seems like those are artifacts which are increased by DLSS. Justice is another game that was directly provided by Nvidia. Nvidia also included a benchmark into the game, which does not really reflect the gameplay of Justice, but it shows what's technically possible and also visually possible. Before we get to the image comparison, we will first look at some numbers. And if you check out the benchmark data here, you can see that this is kind of like a DLSS study. Because even if you run a 4090 without DLSS, this is nowhere near an area that is kind of playable or enjoyable. A 3080 Ti will get you 5 FPS on average, so that is really interesting. On the other hand though, if you run this with DLSS active, this is really nice. This is visually very, very interesting. And as before, we kept track of the power consumption during the benchmark. With DLSS, we saw 320 to 390 watt, on average 371. Without DLSS, this is again increasing and we on average saw 410 watt. With the benchmark included in Justice, Nvidia showcases what kind of potential you can expect from DLSS 3, at least if your game supports it. Without DLSS, this would be absolutely unplayable. And with performance, this is absolutely smooth. Compared to the gameplay from Plague, I also find it a bit easier to spot differences. If you pay attention to the woodwork on the side, you can see without DLSS, this is a little bit smoother and has a little bit more glow to it. With DLSS, it seems to lose all those reflections. If we switch over to this water scene, you can see some tinier waves in the back. With DLSS, it seems to be more waves and a little bit sharper waves. And without DLSS, some of them seem to be disappearing. The last game we're going to look at is Cyberpunk. First of all, without DLSS. And the RTX 4090 will perform about twice as good as the RTX 30 generation. If we now add in the power consumption, you will see compared to a 3080 Ti, the power consumption increased by 46%. That is significant. But what is more significant is the performance increase by 86%. If we then also switch DLSS on, it is just insane. The 4090 with DLSS active delivers 139 FPS on average. That is an increase by about 300%. And now I had a very interesting finding. If we look at the power consumption during Cyberpunk and our benchmark with DLSS active or not active, you will see the 4090 will have 21% less power draw if DLSS is active. I think the reason for this is because DLSS performance will only render in 1080p, which seems to be a little bit lighter for the 4090. In our benchmark scene, you can see 320 to 340 watt with DLSS, and without DLSS, it's 420 watt. So about 100 watt more if DLSS is not active. Similar to the other games tested, I find it extremely difficult to spot visual differences between the settings we had. And I can tell you, even if I pause it, it is almost impossible for me to spot any kind of difference. It might also make sense that you just take your time and replay the footage which we took from the games, and then you can let me know if you spotted some differences. Even though we already talked about the power consumption briefly during the benchmarks, we showed some numbers with WireView. I want to get to this topic a bit more in detail, especially the efficiency. That's why we will go right back to the start with 3D Mark times by Extreme. If we perform a normal 3D Mark times by Extreme run without changing anything on the card, we will get about 123 FPS in the first graphic test. At the same time, the power consumption is at about 420 watt. The RTX 4090 Founders Edition is clocking with this setting at about 2750 MHz. In the next step, I started decreasing the power target in steps of 10%. This means I was using the Asus GPU Tweak 3 software and I set the power target to 90% and tested again. Interestingly, the clock did almost not change. It decreased by about 20 MHz, while the power consumption decreased by 10%. Also, the graphics score was almost the same. I then decided to repeat all the testing from 10 to 130% power target, and the results are extremely interesting. In this chart, you will see the result of 3D Mark times by Extreme, the FPS, in red. The blue line is showing the power consumption of the 4090. Again, at 100%, we see 123 FPS. With 422 watt power consumption. If we move over to the area on the left, which is between 60% and 80% power target, we can see a lot less power consumption, which is between 280 and 380 watt with almost the identical performance. If we now draw an FPS per watt curve, we can see a peak at 50% power target, and that is the most efficient point of the 4090, with about 0.42 FPS per watt. As comparison, a 3090 Ti will have about 0.15. Using a power target of over 50% thus means that we will get more performance, but at the same time, with a bad relation, a lot more power draw. So going back to the other chart, and now we will pay more attention to the area of 60% power target. Compared to the 50% power target, the power draw is slightly more increased, but at the same time the performance is still very good. At this area, my 4090 is still constantly clocking at about 2400 MHz. In result, in times by Extreme, we will lose about 10% in performance. But at the same time, we will decrease the power consumption by about 1/3. This means 33% less power draw. And I also want to point out that because times by Extreme is a synthetic benchmark, this will react much more on lower clocks than games. To further evaluate this, we will look at two games. We will start with PUBG simply because this was a high FPS title which causes high load on the 4090. And with 60% power target, we could decrease the power consumption by 33%, while at the same time we only lost 5% of performance. So subjectively speaking, you will not even notice this. And as a second comparison, we will look at Cyberpunk with active DLSS. In this benchmark, the power consumption was decreased by 20%, while the performance was decreased only by 2%, which is almost measurement tolerance. After that, I also tried to improve this further by using the VF curve editor, which is included in the MSI Afterburner. Unfortunately, no matter what I tried with like the manual undervolting, the performance was always worse than just plainly limiting the power target. At this point, when I was looking at the efficiency curve, I was wondering like who came up with the idea to make the 4090 the way it is on the table right here. Because if you just look at this from a very objective point of view, you can get about 5% less performance with about 130 to 150 watt less power draw. 130 to 150 watt less power draw means a much slimmer cooler. It means avoiding all the drama around the power connector. So many things that just don't make any kind of sense, because the 4090 on this table here performs about 40 to 80% better than the previous cards. You could also get 35 to 75% more performance. Everybody would still be completely flashed by the performance. And you could get a card with 300 watt TDP instead of 450 watt TDP. Nvidia, who came up with this decision? It literally makes no sense. We are in a region that you would typically access with overclocking. That is what you would do. You get like your extra 3, 4, 5% and you have to pay for it with 200 watt more power consumption typically. That's what you also had with the 30th gen. But this way, I don't understand it. There are two more things though I want to discuss about the Founders Edition model. Even though we still talked about the card in our unboxing video, there are two things I want to highlight. It seems like the front fan on my Founders Edition is running a little bit out of round. I'm not quite sure why that's the case, if something went wrong during assembly or manufacturing, but it doesn't look right. However, I could not find any kind of influence like negative impact on the cooling performance or also on the noise level. Also, this would not cause any vibrations to the card, so it's just a visual thing. But on the other hand, the other fan in the back seems to have a problem on the bearing. At least that's what I would assume, because if you set this card to 45% fan speed or above, it's putting out a very strange noise, and I'm not quite sure how to describe that noise, but you can just listen to it yourself. The funny thing though is that I only noticed this right at the end of my testing, simply because the card is running pretty cold and the fans are running at a very low fan speed pretty much all the time, that I only noticed this after adjusting the fan curve manually at the end of my testing. When I set this to like 80% for some testing, then I noticed something sounds a bit odd. But apart from that, for the normal gaming, this is a pretty quiet card, and it's also a pretty cold card. The GPU was typically at around like 63, 64 degrees Celsius for the GPU temperature, and the hotspot just above 70 degrees Celsius, but that is in a perfect region. It's almost time for the conclusion. There is one more thing I want to say about Nvidia, and especially because recently they had to earn a lot of criticism, especially around the EVGA topic. But at least for me, for the 4090 review, how everything was organized, like getting the card, the keynote, the presentation, the review guide, getting all the software, the organization, the communication with Nvidia, like even on a Sunday morning, like 8 a.m., I wrote a message to my Nvidia contact and he replied within like 2 minutes. And that is something where I have to give hats off to Nvidia and especially my contact Jan. Thank you very much for your help during testing phase of the 4090. In my opinion, the 4090 is a legendary card with legendary bad timing. That's not Nvidia's fault though, but just looking at what's going on our planet, we have a card in front of us that is very expensive with a very high power draw in a situation where at least people here in Germany are fighting over like energy prices and everything. So that's a bit unfortunate for Nvidia probably. Just talking about performance though, I think just in history of GPUs, we have never seen such a jump before, especially over 2 generations, because the RTX 30 was already a huge jump in performance, and then the 40 again. Even if you go back to like GeForce 6 to GeForce 7 or GeForce 8 to the 8800 GTX, those were huge jumps, but the RTX 4090 is even more impressive. With the 4090, we saw a sick performance increase. We also saw a sick increase of cooler design. And even though I would definitely question whoever came up running the 4090 at 450 watt TDP instead of like 300 watt, I'm still quite happy with the outcome of the cooler design. Because me personally, and I will definitely get a 4090, I will run this at like 70% power target. I will have much less power draw, but at the same time, you can make use of these huge coolers, which will lead to much better temperatures and great noise levels. That's what we're going to get for the 4090. But again, whoever came up at Nvidia to run this at 450 watt, it just makes no sense. DLSS 3 is a very impressive technology, and I find it mind-blowing how much more performance you can generate with almost no visual loss. But then again, you should probably not take this as an argument to buy your 4090. Because if I just look at the titles which were provided to us, or like benchmarks that were provided to us for testing from Nvidia, none of this is public. For example, A Plague Tale Requiem, if I just launch the game from Steam, the DLSS 3 option is not present. And you never know when will these technologies make it to the market. It kind of feels like with the first RTX cards, RTX On, like ray tracing, was heavily promoted, but only a few titles were available at the market back then. And it takes months and years for this technology to mature and to be available for a lot of games. So just justifying this to buy a 4090 probably doesn't really make a lot of sense. Then again, the performance of the 4090 is just insane, so that will be your argument to get one. probably also insane price, insane power consumption, which doesn't make sense. Yeah, we still have a lot of other stuff. We will probably add this to a second video because I guess this will be too long. We have some questions we asked to Nvidia, for example, but we will do a follow-up. And there will be another video tomorrow with the 4090 from Gigabyte. So make sure to check back. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Bye-bye.